This is the intro to the portfolio assignment. This is part of a larger set of videos talking about how to go about setting up your portfolio, which will be the last part of this class. My example here is one segment of a multi-segmented portfolio that I will be attempting to put together to show you at the end of this course. More on that later. First, some background on this one. This part of my portfolio involves a project that I worked on late in 1999 for the Louisiana Arts and Science Center in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. This is now called the Louisiana Arts and Science Museum and has a completely different logo than the one that I developed for them here. I worked on several parts for the center, but one of the projects that involved most of my time was the creation of what was called an orrery. This is an example of an extremely simple orrery. An orrery is a device used to show how the planets revolve around the sun and how their moons and satellites revolve around them. Here is a much more complex orrery, which was developed at around the time when astronomers only knew about the inner planets and their moons. This following video details for you just how complex these things can become. This being a much more accurate rendition of one that shows all of the inner and outer planets, as well as the rotation of all of their moons. The gear mechanism is quite complicated, and one or two of the main planets rotates in the opposite direction from the others, as do many of the moons. Also, not all of the planet rotations maintain a strict elliptical pattern around the sun, and not necessarily on the same plane. So as you can see, these things are very, very complicated, and an orrery like this, a mechanical orrery like this, is very, very expensive, and not something that you necessarily want to put on display to the general public and have them turning a little crank and those kinds of things. No, what we were going to come up with was something more simple, but hopefully just as engaging. Now, orreries have been used for centuries to describe to lay people the operations of the solar system. Here is a painting of a very early version. And here's a version which was erected on the ceiling of a French palace from around the 1700s. This is where I took my inspiration from. Now, the Louisiana Arts and Science Center is located in what was the Mississippi Valley Railroad Station, which is on the bank of the Mississippi River in downtown Baton Rouge. The railroad company no longer exists, but the railroad tracks still run along behind the museum between the back of the building and the levee which holds back the river. In 1999, they were in the process of constructing this planetarium extension onto the southern end of the old railroad depot. On the ground floor is where they asked me to come up with an exhibit explaining the workings of a solar system, which is what would be discussed in this light show in the planetarium on the second floor under the dome. The Louisiana Arts and Science Museum is now a much larger operation, as you can see from the rendering of the proposed buildings, which was slated for completion sometime in the late 20-teens. Here you can see the old railroad depot in the center of the complex with the Mississippi River stretching out behind it all. Now, initially beginning in 1998, I began with some very preliminary sketches to show the museum board what it was that I was proposing to do. This rather quick elevation drawing shows how I imagined that we would take advantage of the large 4-foot diameter concrete column, which was centered in the lower lobby area and pretty much dominated the space. I wanted to create a dais around the column which would act as both a bench for people to sit on, as well as provide a platform for cast-from-life figures of historical scientists and astronomers. Along the left side of this sketch, you can see a list of people who might appear on that dais, people like Copernicus and Galileo and people like that. This plan view describes how I proposed that we enclose the 4 steel pillars that came just outside of the main concrete pillar. All of this structure was necessary for holding up the floor of the planetarium above, but on this level we needed to do something to disguise it. I proposed that the center column have a half section of a large sphere that would represent the sun. The sphere would be backlit and contain popcorn strobes to approximate the appearance of sunspots. The sun model would have to be constructed in sections modeled from fiberglass and mechanically fastened together so that they could be fitted around the column. Here, then, is another elevation sketch showing how the sun model would be fastened to the center column and the first inklings of the Ori with its small depiction of a planet Mercury just to the left of the sun in the sketch. After several weeks of work, I came up with a series of drawings that showed how all of this would work. Again, this is a much more detailed drawing showing not only how the center column would work, as well as the detail of the enclosures for the outboard steel columns. More details on the dimensions of the sun sections and how the model would work so that it actually looked like a sun surface in motion. To do this, the back of the sun model, the fiberglass portion, was going to be coated with a polarizing film, and then mechanical wheels would rotate another polarizing film in front of a bright white source, which would then project the polarized light onto the back of the static film on the back of the sun model, much like the old light wheels that are projected onto colored lights onto a Christmas tree. This causes the polar motion film to look like it's actually moving, which would give you this swirling pattern, kind of like the way that the sun looks. This is a projected plan view of the way that the Ori was going to work. Each of the planets would be represented with a small model of a planet in some proportion to the size of the sun model surrounding the center column. Each planet model would be attached to a ring of lights that would surround the sun model in equal intervals out from the sun. A computer would be programmed to have the lights flash as they went around the sun, proportional to what is known as a fast clock. In this case, the fast clock would operate so that one solar year would be the length of a 24-hour day. In a very short example, the Earth would be depicted as rotating around the sun once every day. Conversely, the path of Mercury would flash around the sun once every 7 minutes, in proportion to the mercurial year, which is 7 days of Earth time. Pluto, on the other hand, plodded along at the outer extremity of the room and might take it around the room several years. The detailed notes on the drawing spelled all of this out. It was quite a task doing all the math to figure out how that was going to work. Also proposed was a carpet pattern for the floor that would surround the Ori. This was going to be done with floor tiles, and would depict a solar flare which would act as a pointer to the entrance to the stairway, which led up to the outer stairwell to the planetarium. They never followed up on that one. I then had to do a quick sketch showing how all of this might look. These things are done for fundraising, since drawings that I just showed you would be much more difficult to get people to understand what they were raising money for. The old saying is that a picture's worth 1,000 words, but here it's worth thousands of dollars. This is where my involvement with the project came to an end, and I lost track of it after this. I got involved in other exhibit design projects, and the whole thing was eventually handed over to a company whose job it was to actually build what I'd proposed. In the past, I had worked for such a company, but by 1999, I had moved to Chicago and was a freelance exhibit designer. But the planetarium did get built, and they decided to go through with the exhibit that I had proposed for them. Just last year, I got curious and I looked them up, and here it is, just the way that I envisioned it. Right down to the ancillary exhibits surrounding the main core exhibit. Not bad, eh?